Welcome everybody, and thank you very much for joining me. Just a few things which may be helpful as we get underway. I've decided I'm not going to take any questions during the course of the webinar. So what I'll ask you to do is to perhaps use the chat box and just kind of list the questions, and I will make sure to get to them at the end. And of course, for those of you who have really burning questions, you've always most welcome to call me or to email me or to hang around for a little while after we've reached the magic hour of 1 p.m. Also, just to let you know, there is a recording available, so we'll talk to you a little about that towards the end. All right, well, we'll get right underway, and I think what I'll do is I'll start off by just talking to you a little about our agenda, and then I will introduce myself. So today we're going to talk about how you might unleash this inner strategist that is lurking inside you to enhance your creative strategic thinking. I'm going to talk a little about creativity and strategic thinking and some of the myths that surround these. I'm also going to talk about quite a significant shift that is taking place in our world, which has once again changed all our operating conditions. A move from VUCA to BANI, and I'll explain what I mean by both of those. We'll talk about the purpose of, why this is, why do we bother with all of this, and what is it we're trying to do with creative strategic thinking within BANI. And then I'm going to spend the bulk of my time really talking about some tools for creative strategic thinking. All right, well, let's get my introductions over and done with. That's a airbrushed picture of me. As you can see, I look a lot better there than I do in real life. Those of you that are viewing me in this picture are far more lucky than you would be if you were facing me. But I work in the space of future strategy, scenarios, particularly in conditions of uncertainty. Organization development, which is really about developing the strategy and then building the organization's capabilities to really being able to implement the strategy. And obviously leadership, particularly strategic leadership. Now, I'm going to start with a quick question. There is no question there. I'm going to tell you what the question is. And I'd like you to think about this question and to jot down your thoughts, not on the chat box, but on a piece of paper. My question is this: do you think creativity and strategic thinking are innate skills? Creativity and strategic thinking, are they innate? Are you born with them? Are some people just a lot better at it than others? Are some people born with a gift to be great creatives and great strategic thinkers? Just think about that for half a minute, please. Okay, half a minute's a long time when you're waiting to talk, I know, but I've done my best keeping quiet there. So let's get on to really discussing this. I think what we really are facing is a myth that exists about creativity. I think this notion that some people are born being able to do creative thinking more than others is a bit of a myth. Now, clearly, you are going to be born in some cases with some preferences whereby you will practice creativity more than others, but it is a myth that only certain people can be creative. And similarly, it is a myth that only certain people can think strategically. So let's quickly define those. I mean, creativity is about being able to make different and sometimes quite strange associations between concepts, being able to see things in a completely different way, which people would turn around and say, my goodness, how did you think about that? Strategic thinking is the ability to see beyond. It's the ability to see over the horizon. It's the ability to see around corners, to see past what's in front of you. And the two are actually quite closely connected. And we want to talk about this combination of creativity and strategic thinking. So I'm going to start by telling you about some research that was done by NASA. This was done in 2019 and was all around seeking to find more creative astronauts. And surprisingly, they still are quite hooked on astronauts who are above the age of 48. They feel that the best age for an astronaut is 55, because then they have this creativity and strategic thinking, the maturity, as well as the kind of physical strength. So here's some of the things they found. They found that when they looked into the research on creative and strategic thinking, they found that 4 to 5-year-olds, about 98% of them, have genius levels of creative strategic thinking. And as the kids grow older, that disappeared. They did a kind of a comparison with kids who are about 15, and they said that disappears to about 12% of the population. And sadly, when we measure these characteristics in adults, it drops to about 2%. So what do you reckon happens to all of that? Maybe you can use your chat boxes very quickly. Just tell me why you think our levels of creativity and strategic thinking drop so rapidly as we get older. Just interested to see a few of your ideas. Yep, we become inhibited and self-censor. We want to look good, don't we? We don't use it. We get conditioned. Schooling system, the need to comply from society, all these factors really drive the genuine creativity out of us. But as we turn older, and this is a picture of that same girl, incidentally, we understand that we can regain these skills by learning new approaches, new techniques and frameworks. And what these techniques and frameworks really do is they allow us to see the world from a different place, in a different way. The native Indians in America have an interesting saying. They say, what you see of the mountain depends on where you stand. And I think that change in perspective is really important. And one of the things we're going to be talking about today is a range of ways in which you can think about and work on changing your perspective to enhance your creative and strategic thinking. So, the thing that's really important that we need to take into account here is the fact that our world has continued and will continue to change. And in a sense, we've made the shift from VUCA to BANI, and I'll explain what we mean by each of those terms in just a minute. But in essence, what we found is that VUCA is really a product of the Cold War, when the world was really a neat dichotomy between the East and the West, when there were so-called good guys and bad guys, when it was all about the Iron Curtain and what happened behind the Iron Curtain and in front of the Iron Curtain. And I think today what we're seeing is the emergence of a completely new world order, multipolar, multiple powers, multiple perspectives, climate change, shifts in our thinking on gender, on politicians, on virtually every aspect of family life. And that's given rise to this concept of BANI. So let's just quickly have a look at what we mean by that. And for those of you that aren't familiar with what the term VUCA means, VUCA is really this concept of volatility and change, which produces uncertainty and complexity. In fact, complexity produces the uncertainty, and ambiguity, making it very difficult to get a clear view on anything. And this has given way to BANI, which is really a much more fragile concept, where organizations manage to operate even though they're quite brittle and could break at any minute. So organizations and people are often right at the edge. The anxiety levels are very, very high because of this nervousness and this concern about the change that might occur. It's also non-linear, which kind of means that in any situation, cause doesn't necessarily lead to a predictable outcome. So cause and effect are not related in a linear way. They're roundabout and circular ways that are really need to be understood to try to get a handle on that, and unpredictable outcomes. And of course, incomprehensible, meaning very damn difficult to understand. So, very quickly then, how do we cope with this? And this is really a precursor to some of the tools we're going to look at in just a moment. We need a lot more focus on our insights. Insights are really what allow us to develop this creativity and this strategic thinking. Insights allow creative strategic thinking. And I'm going to make a distinction between insights and logic in just a minute. We need to understand that we will never be able to fully predict or even understand what is likely to happen down the track. When we start, we don't really know what the outcomes are going to be. We need to practice mindfulness and patience. I had a trip down to Bondi Junction this morning to do some printing, and certainly patience and mindfulness is not something you observe in Sydney traffic in the morning, that's for sure. And a number of these single occupants in these large SUVs is really quite amazing. We certainly need better strategic thinking and the willingness to continuously adapt. So all these changes have meant a whole bunch of new skills that need to be developed, but the purpose of creative strategic thinking remains much the same. I mean, I'm often asked, what is the purpose of strategy? And the purpose of strategy and creative strategy is to position yourself in the future in such a way that you have a competitive advantage. If you're not really needing to position yourself differently in the future, or if you don't need to derive a competitive advantage, you don't really need a strategy and you don't really need to be creative. A good old plan will do you. And again, I'll make a distinction between a plan and strategy. They're actually different concepts, and we need to really understand that quite clearly and get to grips with those. So, how do we do this? Well, what I've tried to do is I've tried to distill 7 key approaches that really help us to kind of work our way through this Barney situation. I don't think we're ever going to be able to deal fully with it. I think we're going to need to in some way learn to cope. This is a coping mechanism as much as it is. It's not a solution to Barney, it's a way of coping with Barney. So 7 frameworks for creative strategic thinking made specially for you for Barney. And Barney, remember, means brittle, anxious, non-linear, and incomprehensible. All right, the first thing that I really would like to talk about is the mistake that so many organizations and people make when they sit down to draw up a plan and they think they're doing strategy. Planning is not strategy. They're very different concepts. And certainly I'm working hard to keep them separate, and I'll talk to you about an assignment I'm working on right at the moment where I'm really struggling to do that against the kind of wishes of the management and leadership team. Why are they separate and why are they different? So if we start off by examining strategy, what we need to understand is that strategy is a learning exercise. It's an exercise that is designed to derive new insights, new breakthroughs. And in order to do that, we have to use divergent thinking which actually makes crazy, strange, and sometimes out of the ordinary associations, and really creates different ways of looking at what's going on. It also involves the use of analogy, like someone once said to me, Norman, you're actually a business doctor. And because I could never, this is a funny ongoing story, of course, in my family. I come from a medical family. My brother's an anaesthetist. I like to say that Robin's job is exactly the same as mine. He puts people to sleep. He just uses a somewhat more elegant way of doing it as an anaesthetist. But they've always wondered what to do. And so to call myself a business doctor is not actually accurate. But the analogy is that I diagnose, I find out what's wrong, and I help to fix things, or help people to help themselves to fix it. So analogy is quite important. So that's what strategy is. If you look at planning, planning is an action-orientated process. It's about doing stuff. It's about achieving milestones and objectives and concrete outcomes. And it uses, in contrast, it uses logical and linear thinking. Now, the problem with trying to combine them is that action is the natural enemy of thought. which means that if you are in a rush, if you're pressurized, you're not likely to be very focused on strategy, but simply on planning. And so what I find is that when you combine the two, in fact, the term strategic planning to me is a bit of an oxymoron, because I think it's a combination of two completely different and opposite concepts. And maybe that's a creative thought, I don't know. But the two don't really live well together. And when you try to do the two together, you find that the doing drives out the learning and the thinking. So one of the things that I do when I take on consulting assignments or strategy development or developing a growth strategy for an organization is I try to separate the two. So tomorrow I'm actually running a strategy session with my client under much protest, where all we're really going to do is think about the bigger picture and the bigger issues and try to start from first principles, get those things really clear. And then later on next week, we will actually undertake the specific planning by using the insights that we derived in the strategy. So planning doesn't really allow you to develop insights. Planning is based on logic, strategy is based on insights, and that's why the two are inherently different. So my second kind of point then is that we need to focus on generating the insights. And how does one do that? Well, there are three elements to it. I think the first is a kind of a probing process. So if you think about the space probe or a medical instrument that probes, what it does is it goes into the situation, it explores it, it tries to understand the dimensions, what's really going on and what's really happening in that situation. In other words, it tries to get all the facts really clear. How large, how small, what position, where's it going, what's it doing? It's really a very logical exercise. The sensing approach, once you've touched it and explored it and felt it, is to think it through, and through the use of insight to reach some understanding about what's really going on. And that's really important, because that kind of tells you, what does your exploration mean? What does the data really mean? What's it really telling you? And finally then to respond, which means to take the appropriate action. And this of course is a circular process. It's a circular process. So you probe, you sense, you respond, and then you see what reaction the situation or the environment has developed. And you probe again, and you sense again, and you respond. And that's in essence what the agile process tries to do. The agile process tries to do that at speed, but sadly what's happened is that speed and doing it quickly has become the real issue rather than the need to develop the insights. So what you find is that organizations are saying, try something, see what happens, then try something else. And they're not necessarily taking the time to derive the insights and to understand what the experience really means that they've just had. So this is about a focus on generating insights and using that to continuously loop around to probe again and sense again and then respond again. Now, a nice way to understand this, I think, is to use a really interesting model which is very, very new, and I hadn't really come across this until I read the work of Natalie Dixon. This is something she developed last year, 2022. It's called the Wonder Rigor approach. Now, I've spelt rigor the way that she would spell it. It's a trademark to her. If you look up the Wonder Rigor approach, you might see more information about this. There's a YouTube video about it. But what it really did is it really got me thinking about the experience of my niece who lives in LA. Robin's my brother, the anaesthetist. Ariella's his daughter. And she recently got a grant from a venture capitalist organization to develop a new product. And I want to just talk you through how that really occurred. But first, let's talk about the model. So in the model, she argues that there are two dimensions that really drive creative strategic thinking. The first is the horizontal dimension, and that's the difference between hacking and inventing. So, you see these tools, these books called brain hacks or efficiency hacks. A hack is something where you just take what has been done before, you copy it and you use it. Invent, of course, is to create something completely new and different. So that's the dimension there, is about speed and about careful development. That's the trade-off there. The provoke specialize is an interesting idea. Provoke really means think broadly, be curious, ask questions, make really crazy associations. And the specialize means focus very deeply and work very carefully to understand the minute details of the situation with great accuracy. So if we begin to populate that, then we know provoke is about being imaginative and audacious, whereas specializing is about deep focus and detail, as we've just explained. Hacking is about taking things that we've seen other people do, which seem to work, copying them or adapting them at speed. And inventing is about thought leadership. It's about creating something new and doing so in an agile way. Now what that does is it produces 4 different styles of really operating in this space. There's an analyze space, which means you just figure out what other people have done and you analyze it very deeply. There's a freedom space, which means you just go around saying what you want, being provocative and really moving on, not necessarily focusing much on anything else. The wonder phase, which he's really interested in, is about imagining, but also inventing at the same time. So asking, what would happen if? How about we do this? Let's try that. And then conducting, if you like, thought experiments, where you really try to understand in some way how these different things are connected in a very agile way. And finally, the rigor is about taking these thought experiments and examining them in fine detail and testing them. Now, the model that she proposes is that we need to oscillate between wonder and rigor, which is another way of really talking about the the probe, sense, respond. It's kind of a neat way to understand probe, sense, and respond. It says you start off out of curiosity with inspiration and reflection and daring, and then you plunge into the discipline, the practice, the skills, repetition, really testing and seeing if it's working. And then you move up again and say, well, gee, that didn't work so good. Maybe I need to kind of think differently, or maybe I need to change this bit. What did I learn from that? Let me try something else here and see if I can work it out. And this kind of continuous oscillation. So, to Ariella Chorn. She finished her uni. She did a kind of really interesting combination of psychology and physical education. And like many, she got a job which needed her to go to work. But during the time of COVID, like so many of us, she had actually bought a dog, a gorgeous border collie. Now, border collies are actually supposedly one of the more clever species that we have in our canine species. And she was kind of wondering, what the hell do I do with my dog during the day? And as she started talking to her friends about it, she started recognizing that this is an issue that so many of her friends really had. So this was a very, very interesting process. She started asking questions. What would happen if we got other people to walk and look after the dog? What would happen if these people were no good and cruel to the animals? What would happen if they took them to really lovely parks where they could be and enjoy themselves? Or if they took them to concrete jungles, which is really very scary for the dogs? What would happen if the dog got sick? Does the person take them to a vet? Who are the good vets? What are the vets nearby? What are the parks nearby? And so this whole curiosity and inspiration and reflecting space, the wonder space, really took place. And then she plunged into the rigor. She went out and she did research. She found out how many people in the area really needed people to look after their dogs. She found out what are the characteristics of dog lovers, not someone who just says, I love dogs, but what are the behaviors of a true dog lover? And what are the things the dogs love to do if they've been locked up for the day and then get walked out? Do they like to walk with other dogs? What kind of breeds go together best? Where are the nearest parks, which the geographical location they were working in would actually would have? What are the vets they can use? Could we strike up a deal with the vets to give us really very discounted fees for treating the dogs? And she took that information and she went back again and she kind of refined her approach. And she got this thing so sorted out and so well designed and with such rigor and such wonder that she got this VC company to fund her $50,000 to really develop an app for this process. So it's kind of like an Uber for dog walking. But it's a great idea and it's got all the research in it. So, before you kind of sign up to be a dog walker, they don't only want to know, can you write your name and stand upright? They want to know what your track record has been. They want to know what your own dog history has been. They want to know all these things, and all these issues have been sorted out. And so what she found is that by using this approach, and of course she wasn't necessarily aware of it, but when I made sense of this and discussed this with my brother and Ariella, Robin and Ariella, they said, yep, that's exactly what she did. She went up and down, up and down. And it's kind of like shifting from a kind of a microscope to a telescope, back to a microscope, back to a telescope. And maybe that's what they mean when they talk about being ambidextrous. It means the big picture, the small picture, the big picture, the small picture. And you need to keep oscillating between the two. And really, this is what the agile journey should be about. But it unfortunately isn't. I think what we've done is we've sacrificed the wonder and the insight for the speed and the expediency in many cases. Not always, but in many cases. So that's the wonder rigor approach, which I found to be a particularly powerful one. And I think it's a way of really coping in the Barney world. Now, this always kind of gets people interested. How do you build memories of the future? How do you track the footprints of the future if you haven't been there before? Well, it turns out that the brain's quite an interesting kind of tool in our body, in that the brain can easily fool us. In the same way as we fool our brain, the brain can actually fool us. I mean, you all know you're woken up after a bad dream and you actually feel the emotion associated with that dream, even though the situation that was described, you were chased by an axe-wielding kind of murderer down the corridors of your own home. I mean, that sort of fear and anxiety stays with you in the morning because your brain is actually, and all the kinds of responses and hormones and neurotransmitters that response causes actually gets you to feel that fear. So the brain can fool us, but we can fool the brain as well. And ways of fooling the brain are really very simple things, starting off with a field trip. If you believe that something can't be done, go and see someone who's doing it. I remember years back when we were in the 1990s, when we were trying to downsize the size of the aviation fire services, which was really a very expensive part of any airports. Airports were graded from 1 to 9, 9 being the most significant sort of sophisticated airline where you could land a jumbo 47 in those days, and it needed a certain length of runway, but it also needed a certain number of aviation firefighters. And I mean, there was this very strong view in Australia that there was a certain number that you needed on a grade 9 airport. And I said, but hang on a second, guys, at Logan Airport, which is one of the busiest in the world in Boston, they've got very different statistics. They said, we don't believe you. And I managed to persuade the brigade to get funding to take a field trip to Boston, to Logan Airport, to actually observe these firefighters in action. So actually seeing a situation which you thought was impossible changes your realm of what is possible. It actually creates a different memory process, different thinking process. Case studies do the same, maybe not as powerful because they don't elicit all the senses as powerfully as a field trip does. This is similar to the use of metaphor and analogy. Something like, I'm the business doctor, is the use of a metaphor, or do it like Mick Jagger, if you like, walk like Mick Jagger. That kind of conjures up a whole sort of image as an analogy, and it kind of gives you a sense in one word what it looks like, what it feels like, and what it does. But there's also another really powerful technique developed in the design thinking industry by Luma, and they talk about alternative worlds. And this is a powerful exercise that I've actually seen in use. So imagine if you were doing some work for a hospital, and one of the concerns that this hospital had is it was getting really poor outcomes and poor results from the surveys they did on patient satisfaction. Now, clearly, patient satisfaction isn't the only criterion. You would like the people to live as well. But assuming they do live and they're treated, properly, you'd like them to be happy and satisfied, because this particular hospital was getting so much negative feedback and so much negative social media that it was actually affecting the way that they were capable of working and the kind of numbers they were attracting. So the exercise that was put together was to say, why don't we go and look at an example of another institution in another world that has to contend with the same thing, that has to integrate a large number of functions. So in hospitals, you've got doctors, surgeons, nurses, pharmacists, psychologists, orderlies, food people, and they've all got to kind of work together to treat the patient. Whereas in so many instances, you kind of, if you've had a sick relative as I had, and you go in and you're sitting there, and the next doctor comes in and they'll say, "What did the nurse say?" As if they don't know. Or what did the pharmacist tell you? Or they'll prescribe a food which, the nutritionist said, no, they're not meant to eat, and they don't actually know. So there's not a lot of coordination. They were taken to a 5-star hotel, which does that very same job in a completely seamless way. So if you're staying in a great hotel, you should know that everything is linked together. Your check-in and reservation is lined up with the room you prefer. The fridge is filled with the beers that you like. When you pick up the phone, they know your name, and all the services are completely integrated to produce a completely different patient experience. So that's the alternative worlds. There are many other examples. You might say to yourself, how would Mercedes-Benz solve this problem? Or what's the approach that Disneyland might take to this situation? So transporting people and transporting yourself and creating a different memory of what the future possibility might look like is a very powerful way of achieving that creative strategic thinking. Now, this next one is something I use quite a lot in my work in scenario planning, in developing people's ability to develop strategies, creative strategies for the future when the future is uncertain. And what I really tell them is that rather than ignoring uncertainty and just building your strategy as if the world in 5 years' time will be exactly the same as it is today, embrace the uncertainty and use it to understand possibilities that exist in the future. So here's an interesting picture. This is actually a crack in the Earth's surface produced by a fault line that opened up just outside Nairobi in Kenya. And what it reflects is a shift in hitherto unknown tectonic plates in that part of the world, which had begun to shift. And the expectation is that this will actually cause quite a shift and change in the landscape in the city just outside Nairobi. And I like to think of uncertainties as being the fault lines, the stress lines, the lines that represent the tensions which have not yet been resolved in our current structure of our markets and our environment. So today's uncertainties are really where the cracks and the changes may appear to change our landscape. So rather than doing what so many companies do when they look at the uncertainties in the environment, they kind of say, oh, this is something for our risk register. and they complete their risk register, and they write it all up with mitigating strategies, and they color code it yellow, green, yellow, red, in terms of the level of urgency and what needs to be done. And then they push it aside and they just continue with their normal linear approach to planning and strategy. Rather than doing that, trying to understand, and there are techniques that you can do, but simply just recognizing that uncertainties today are the fault lines or the stress lines in the way our markets our markets operate, our markets and our environment, our community is structured. And these cracks or these fault lines and these uncertainties will appear as cracks and changes in the way the whole landscape takes place and manifests itself. And that's a particularly important thing to recognize. So rather than avoiding uncertainty, because we know the brain abhors uncertainty, the brain regards uncertainty as danger and avoids it. Rather than doing that, embrace it. Recognize it as key part of your strategy and thinking. And one way to become creative about that in your strategic thinking is to understand that these uncertainties represent the future changes in your landscape. I think we go right back to the classics here, and we recognize, what's the purpose of strategy? Well, the purpose of strategy is competitive advantage in the future. And, competitive advantage is an important concept for profit businesses and for not-for-profits. I mean, for profit businesses or businesses that are for profit, you really want to be able to convince your buyer that they should buy from you rather than your competitor. So that's a natural thing. For not-for-profits, I think what you need to recognize is that you still have to demonstrate as a not-for-profit that you provide the best service, the best outcome, the best solution for the funding you receive from whether it's government or some kind of funding agency or even the community. You've got to actually show that your service has a competitive advantage on alternative ways of being able to do that. Now, one of the things, sadly, that we need to do in any environment, in any resource-constrained environment, is to recognize that trade-offs are your friend. This is something that was said in the early 80s by Michael Porter, that in order to get focus, which is necessary for competitive advantage, you've actually got to emphasize some things at the expense of others. And what we understand then is that this focus, this trade-off, is actually an imbalance. It's a deliberate imbalance in the way you set your business up, in the way you run your life. If you want to be an expert cricketer, then it probably means that you're going to have to give up your winter sports. We all know that a sprinter who trains as a sprinter is not necessarily going to make it as a long-distance runner. And there are all kinds of physiological differences there, but also the nature of the training. It's the emphasis you place, and it's typically of strategy. It's not only what you decide to do, it's what you deliberately decide not to do. So if you are focused on achieving competitive advantage, stands to reason you have to be prepared to make trade-offs. You have to be prepared to choose what you're going to do and what you're not going to do. And I can just tell you now, I'm dealing with a family business at the moment that is on a path to becoming a corporate entity, and hopefully with global aspirations. And there are a lot of things that they've done nicely as a family business which have produced great outcomes for all the stakeholders, external stakeholders like customers and internal stakeholders like the shareholders. And if they are to grow and if they are to become more competitive in what is going to be a global market, they're going to have to introduce rigor and discipline and focus. And that's meaning they're going to have to stop doing some things which they thought was part of their traditional DNA. And sometimes what you thought was your strength may turn out to be the millstone around your neck. You've got to make those tough choices and make trade-offs to get focused to achieve competitive advantage. And the last one I want to focus on is the need to pause to gain insight. A lot of people have a lot of difficulty with this, particularly in a fast-moving world. Because I often say to them, slow down in order to speed up. And they say, are you crazy? Got to move more quickly. Well, I think there are situations where you can move quickly and situations where you've got to pause. So where the problem is complicated and difficult, but where there is a right answer and where there is best practice evident, you can move more quickly. So where the answers have been well established in other quarters, for example, like building a bridge or drawing up a balance sheet, there are best practices associated with that. There's a right answer. We call that a complicated problem, but we don't need to be technical at the moment. The only point I'm making is if there's a best practice solution and a right answer, you can move quickly. You get the manual out and you figure out how to do this. Flying an aircraft is in fact a complicated issue, which is why the manuals and learning the rules are so important. But you need pause and you need insight when the problem is unusual, when it's complex and unusual. And here are some of the clues. There are many different experts with different answers. That's really crazy when you've got a really complex problem and you go around asking people for advice, so-called experts, and you get different opinions. Never do that in Israel, by the way. Every person has a different opinion, even in the cabinet, the political party, in parliament. So they're different experts. They've all got different solutions. And there's evidence as well that different solutions might suit and work in different contexts. And a good situation is something like COVID or world hunger or poverty, where the solution that worked in Scandinavia or Sweden didn't necessarily work in Australia or the UK. And every country has to figure out its own situation because the context is different. So where the situation is complex, where it is unusual, when we've never encountered it before, typically you'll find experts with different solutions. That's where you really need to pause, reflect to gain that insight. That's a really important way of learning to cope with Barney. So as I move just to summarize, and we will have the opportunity to have a look at your questions in a moment. And so I will give you a chance to put your questions in the chat box in just a moment. I spoke about the myths of creativity and strategic thinking. I really believe that creativity and creative strategic thinking are skills and frameworks that can be learnt by people, even old dogs like myself. You can't teach old dogs new tricks. Now, I'm not suggesting that certain dogs like bloodhounds might be more naturally capable of smelling out things than other dogs. I had staffies before. I've got a greyhound now. I had a staffy before. Staffies are not very clever. They can't smell very well. They can smell food, but that's about it. So there are certain natural advantages which some of us are born with. But you can develop the skills of creative strategic thinking by learning and practicing those particular frameworks and tools, particularly the wonder rigor approach. Barney definitely needs different thinking. This is not the world that maybe some of us went to school in and learned some of our lessons in. The world is changing. Even from VUCA to Barney is a shift. And we need to understand and appreciate that planning does not mean strategy. And it's really a good idea to start with strategy first and complete your strategic thinking, your creative strategic thinking first, before you then undertake your planning exercise, as difficult a task as that might be. I am struggling. This client of mine tomorrow is like, every time I turn my back, they put something in the agenda for tomorrow, which is about setting milestones and objectives and profitability. And I say, no. So it's not easy, but it's an important distinction to make. I think this idea of creating new neural pathways, creating new memories, if you like, of future possibilities, really important. Think of uncertainty as a fault line, as a potential crack, a change in the way the environment is going to manifest, the way the market is going to change. And use new worlds as a way of thinking about what might be possible in your environment, which you may otherwise have thought not possible. And I think the wonder rigor approach, which really talks about this need to cycle from rigor to wonder to rigor to wonder, is really a very good approach to use. To me, it sums up the insight logic kind of split very well. Explore and then do the hard work. If you just stay in the explore mode, you'll just become a crazy kind of scientist. If you just do the hard work, you'll just become a boring analyst. You need to do both. And I know there's some people in this audience, Lisa, who've actually done that. And I think that's really good that you've combined the two. So, as we wind down to the last 10 minutes, I'll just share with you some ways I can work with you. I'm happy to mentor any of you that have problems, for example, the need to develop a new marketing plan or a new business plan. I do keynotes. I can do a keynote on some key issues like psychological safety if you feel that's an important issue that your team needs to get, your business needs to get across. I run workshops on key issues like scenario thinking to develop new insights into how to understand the future. And of course, like most people in the consulting space, I'm happy to co-design with you a process and approach to address a really specific challenge like how do we grow into the future for your business. Any more information on that, please contact me directly on my email address or visit my website. And now, on time, I've reached the time to look at any questions you have. So, any questions you have, I'm very happy to answer. So the first question I've got, there are a few comments here. Yes, thank you. So please use your chat box and share your questions with me. The first question is LLMs, so large language models like AI and ChatGPT, which my colleagues Tamar Alpaca and Lisa Carlin know about very well. Lisa ran a very successful group yesterday on exploring the uses of these tools. I think strategic thinking, let me answer this question in two ways. I think firstly, as we find machine learning and automation replacing a lot of the more standardized linear jobs in our workplace, slowly but surely, I think we find that creativity and strategic thinking becomes even more important. And the ability to use judgment and wisdom, which is really the ability to take in new evidence and change your perception or perspective on something, becomes even more important. Human skills will become more important. With very specific reference to ChatGPT and large language models, AI models, we find that if you ask really lousy questions and put in lousy probes, you get lousy, generic, stereotypical answers. So the strategic thinking is still vitally important in knowing how to ask the questions and thinking about the questions. You know, people often ask, what is the main skill of a consultant? The main skill of a consultant is really to know what questions to ask. And that's where the strategic thinking is really important. So yes, ChatGPT, AI is going to speed up a lot of the processes we need to do, but the ability to know what to probe and what to look for is really important. Yeah, Lisa says that AI tools make it more important to have strategic skills because the lower value jobs will eventually be replaced by robots. Okay, any other questions? I'm not letting you go until 1 o'clock, so you're going to stick. By the way, I've got a special feature on your Zoom. You can't log off until 1 o'clock, so you need to ask me more questions. Any other questions? No other questions? Gee, either I've done a good job or no one understood anything. Let me see. I will deal with how strategic thinking skills can be measured, Lisa. I'll talk about that later. How often do you run strategic thinking versus planning? Look, I think Martin's asked that question. How often do we need to do strategic thinking versus planning? I think that as the environment speeds up, and the changes in your industry speed up, and obviously that will differ from industry to industry, but I think what you need to be doing in strategic thinking is to if your environment isn't moving very quickly, you need to be continuously examining what the fault lines are. What are the key uncertainties which are emerging? And often that occurs as a result of a change in legislation or new consumer behavior or new consumer preferences or new technology. So in a rapidly changing environment, and I think your environment is one, because I know your environment is one where I think there's been a massive change, a change both in technology and in legislation, which has completely disrupted the nature of the industry. I think you need to do some serious strategic thinking there and maybe need to monitor that on an ongoing basis. But for example, if you're in pharmaceuticals, I think you probably need to be doing that almost on an ongoing basis. You need to be examining the emerging trends, the emerging uncertainties, the new molecules which are being created. So I think it really depends, but I would roughly be looking at the ratio of strategic thinking to planning as 1:3. So one deep strategic thinking process for 3 cycles of plan. One strategic thinking process for 3 plans. I don't mean once a year or once every 3 years. I'm just saying the tempo should be every third planning session. You should really do a strategic thinking session as well. Irene's asked, do I have any suggestions to the trends about AI and GPT? Look, again, I think as I attended this really interesting talk run by Lisa Carlin, who's on the call at the moment, yesterday. It was a group that she ran. I co-facilitated it. Was some very interesting views from chief technology officers who said, we don't really know yet. We have to wait and see. But the one thing I can say is that the trends that are really obvious and relevant now are that the lower value jobs are going to be replaced, are being replaced. Things like writing copy for advertising or writing copy for brochures, these things can be speeded up, and I imagine that's going to get better and a lot better much more quickly. Tools that can actually create videos for you and do slideshows for you, those are getting a lot better. So a lot of the kind of time-wasting things could actually kind of work to change quite rapidly. But I still think the strategic thinking skills and knowing how to operate those tools are really going to be critically important. I will answer this other AI question, but any other questions about some of the things we spoke about today before I get to that? Does the Wonder-Rigger model let me flow from left to right? Look, let me just turn back to that Wonder-Rigger model. It doesn't flow. I mean, essentially what we're saying is if you want to be creating, if you want to improve your creative strategic thinking, the right-hand side of the model is the one you want to work in. If you're happy just to copy what other organizations are doing, then the hacking approach is okay. I was quite interested in some of our findings recently in Australia about our levels of productivity, which are steadily declining, and the levels of creativity and strategic thinking, which are really low. I mean, my first comment, I think, which has raised a few eyebrows, is that I'm quite amused that we're thinking about talking about a 4-day working week at the moment. I think with our levels of productivity, we probably need to be thinking about a 6-day working week until we get our productivity levels up. And one of the drivers of our productivity levels is, in fact, more creative strategic thinking. So I would have thought that, you know, one of the things that's really interesting is to work on that right-hand side and probably shift the emphasis a bit more towards it. I'm not saying it's only Wonder and Rigger. I think there is some hacking and specialization. But at this point in time, the Wonder-Rigger approach is very rarely used. We need to increase the proportion of use on that side of the model much more than it is today. And only you would know what's the right combination for your particular industry. There's a a reference which Lisa's just put onto the website, onto the chat line. Discussions on AI and other innovations are covered in our community. I'm also a member of the Future Builders group, so there's a link there, URL, to that, the OD Hive, the Organization Development Hive, which will present some of those research findings to you. Is the Wonder Rigger model different from scenario planning? Very much so. It's about really just improving your ability to do creativity and strategic thinking. It isn't the whole scenario planning approach at all. Yeah. Okay, well, I think I've pretty much reached the end of what I have to share with you. And so just really to end off, I'm saying please don't forget that you can contact me for further information about any of these things that I can do. And I'm happy to have a discussion with you on email or LinkedIn or anything like that. But lastly, thank you very much for your attendance today. I hope it's been helpful. I'm happy to stay online for a little while longer and we can answer some of your further questions a little more directly. Thank you very much, folks. Have a great day.